Welcome. We continue today our studies in the book of Judges. And again, it would be helpful for you to have a Bible open before you while we look at chapter 7 verse 24 to 8 verse 35. Indeed, you might again like to pause this recording to read it first, as it's a long section of the book. As usual, there will be questions at the end for both personal and group use. Now, there is something very strange about this entire section. Most of the actions that Gideon takes can be justified. And yet, as one reads through this account, one gets an increasing sense that all is not well. Thus, each section provokes the question, was Gideon right or wrong? And the answer is usually maybe. And this is the great problem with so many of our actions. They can invariably be justified, sometimes with very good theological reasons, but what deep down is the motive? Is it God-honouring, or are motives mixed? Or is what we say merely an excuse? Every Christian leader knows that this is one of the most difficult issues in pastoral care. On the surface, all may appear well, or there may be only a hint that things are not quite right. As the Midianites flee, Gideon calls for the intervention of the tribe of Ephraim. Prompt support is sought and given, and the result is that Oreb and Zeb, two of the ringleaders of the Midianite hordes, are captured trying to recross Jordan and are put to death. So far, so good. As Judges 12:1-6 will show, Ephraim, the tribe of Joshua, considered itself the senior tribe of the Israelite Confederation. Gideon was an Abiezerite. A who? One can hear an Ephraimite saying. But he had only called Ephraim to mopping up operations. What an indignity for the tribe, who thought it should lead. So they resorted to the timeless tactic and criticised Gideon sharply. The fact that Gideon was obeying the Lord seemed to have passed them by, or certainly constituted a minor consideration. After all, their pride was hurt. So often this is the case at a time of blessing. The devil seems very active to undermine the work of the Lord. And one of the most effective ways is to divide the people of God and thus undermine their prosperity. What then do we make of Gideon's response? This was no time for infighting, and there are occasions when humility is better than force. And this is, of course, the action Gideon resolved upon. He pointed out that they had captured the leaders of the Midianite Federation. What was his own achievement in the light of such a magnificent catch? So we're told the Ephraimites' resentment against him subsided. Or was this response symptomatic of Gideon's own sense of inadequacy emerging once again? Would firm action at this point have avoided future problems? And the problem we have is that we don't know. And similar questions keep resurfacing. Weary yet still pursuing, Gideon arrives at two Israelite village outposts, Succoth and Peniel. At each he made the same request, a moderate one, bread but not meat. The leaders of Succoth, near as they were to the territory of the Midianites, seemed unwilling to put their head in the noose if events turned against Gideon. Referring to an ancient practice of war, the cutting off of the hands of the vanquished, they refer to two of their Midianite leaders still alive, Zebah and Zalmunna. Without their capture, they have no intention at all of helping Gideon. Gideon's response was understandable, or their response rather was understandable but faithless. They refused to recognize the work of God and declined to have any part in the victory of Gideon. Gideon understandably recognized this as evidence of apostasy. In language drawn from the vocabulary of holy war, he warns the inhabitants of Succoth that he will now treat them as enemies, and hence he warns, "I will tear your flesh with the desert thorns and briars." Peniel gets a similar warning, "I will tear down this tower." Victory soon followed, and Gideon returned and fulfilled his dark promise. He is able to offer his reasons. He has now captured the chieftains of whom they spoke, and they had failed to help exhausted men. If he had wanted a biblical justification, he could have doubtless appealed to Deuteronomy chapter 20 verse 13, which you might look up. Yet the language and the savagery of his actions makes the reader uncomfortable, especially bearing in mind that Gideon had needed quite some convincing and encouragement to respond to God's call himself. Someone has said, the judge seems to have no compunction about torturing or killing those Israelites who have doubts in him, which is in sharp contrast to the treatment he received from the Lord when Gideon was himself in doubt. One is tempted to ask the question, does Gideon throw his weight around with the weak and vulnerable, while temporizing with powerful Ephraim? Students of this passage disagree on their verdict, and perhaps we are meant to be confused. This does not mean that we ought not to be challenged by the failure of these two villages. Too often Christian churches have people who seem more concerned to further their own ambitions and build up their pride than manifest grace in love and unity and in self-effacement. Too often there are those who for all their fine words do nothing to advance the Lord's cause. We need to be alerted to this part of Gideon's story. At best, we are unspiritual. At worst, we're strangers to the grace of God. Equally, those of us in leadership do well not to throw our weight around and fail to offer the grace and mercy to others that we have ourselves received in such abundance. Interpretation of verses 18 to 21 in this passage is very difficult. There are various possibilities. Is this all the language of what we might call epic chivalry, and therefore not to be taken at face value? The fate of these men is sealed. Or is this an implied challenge to produce these men alive? Perhaps we should choose the simple option. Gideon would have shown compassion for the enemy if they had not killed his family, presumably some time prior to the events described in these chapters. If this is the case, Gideon shows less willingness to show concern for his own people than his enemies. Moreover, the enemies of God's people were to be destroyed again. All this reads far more like a personal vendetta than a holy war in obedience to the Lord. Attempting to exonerate Gideon here seems as if we're straining at an act to swallow a camel. So earlier hesitations about his motives and approach are apparently receiving a confirmatory nudge. This makes one deeply suspicious of Gideon's subsequent actions. Getting his young teenage son to do his dirty work can be variously seen as an unsavoury attempt to humiliate Zebah and Zalmunna. Equally, it can be viewed as a sort of dynastic claim for Jether, his firstborn. Remember him, the Israelites might have said when Gideon died. He slew Zebah and Zalmunna when he was only a slip of a lad. What an ideal judge he would make. It's certainly difficult to see Gideon's suggestion in a God-honouring light. And the same goes for the plunder he takes, the ornaments of the camels' necks. Is this the first step to acquiring worldly splendour to bolster his judgeship? It is difficult to escape the conclusion that self was reasserting itself in Gideon. Mighty in the heat of battle, he was learning what we need to learn. It's often when the going is easier and in the day-to-day life that faithfulness to the Lord is more difficult to sustain. Christian preachers who challenge their hearers as to whether they have the resources for the heat of the battle have often got it wrong. The greatest need is not for when we're utterly cast upon the Lord, but when power and prosperity allows us to build our foundations elsewhere. This brings us to verses 22 to 27. The offer of dynastic power was understandable, and Gideon's response commendable and theologically impeccable. Or was it? Is Gideon giving an outright no, or is he saying, yes, though you ought to bear in mind that actually the Lord is our ruler? Certainly he begins to act more and more autocratically and to assume the trappings of royal power. And what are we to make of a man, one of whose sons is named Abimelech? "My father is king." So to the account of the making of an ephod. Some suggest that the amount required to make this ephod indicates that some sort of representation of the Lord is intended here. Probably, however, it's better to understand ephod in its more normal sense, and to assume that this was either part of the wealth of war that was used to make it, or that the trappings associated with it demanded this vast hoard of gold ornaments, pendants, and garments. The ephod was in fact probably a priestly garment, probably modelled on that of the Aaronic priest, which contained some objects which were used to seek God's guidance. The sanctuary at Shiloh was the best part of a day's walk away, and presumably Gideon, always prone to want special reassurances that he was in God's will, made it, and it was intended to secure the guidance of God locally. Gideon had enjoyed the leading and the blessing of God. Perhaps his initial motives were good, but he was hankering after something which God had not ordained. And as one notes, guidance as man likes to receive it can be nothing but a snare and a delusion. Thus the ephod did become a snare, and led, we surmise, Gideon and the people to view it selfishly and magically as a guarantee of the Lord's blessing, irrespective of their obedience and faithfulness. And the writer of Judges, who does not always spell out the meaning of his story, as we've already seen, sums it up very baldly here. Israel prostituted themselves. How easily too our early aspirations to spend and be spent for the Lord become exchanged for a comforting complacency, arising from the fact that we're sure he's for us. Such an attitude is nearer to the religion of Canaan than it is to true faith in the Lord. We need to be very watchful. If Gideon could fall, so can we. The final verses of the section we're looking at today wind up the account of Gideon's life. Despite his failures, the land enjoyed peace for 40 years, and the Midianite threat did not ever raise its head again. But all was far from well. The glory of God can be easily exchanged for personal glory. All that Gideon was resulted from the grace of God, but the very munificence of the Lord's grace ensnared him. If he rejected the title of king, he assumed all the trappings of an oriental monarch. His great confession, if such it was belied by his actions. How easy is it for us to rejoice in our gifts and abilities and not in the giver and enabler? How ready we too exchange thoughts of the Lord's glory to that of our own. Again, the experience of Gideon should warn us. Tragically, Gideon's failure was sowing seeds for future disaster. He adopted the amoral lifestyle of ancient monarchs, and in terms reminiscent of ancient descriptions of kings we read that he had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. If he lived like a king, it's scarcely surprising that the following chapter describes a bitter dynastic battle. Anticipating a little, our author introduces us to Abimelech, who certainly had royal ambitions. But what on earth was Gideon doing, having a concubine? Small wonder then that disaster followed. Gideon had done much good, but as one student with justification says, it is Gideon of all the judges who does the most harm to Israel. His forgetfulness was followed by that of the nation. During the period of the judges, they were never to know real peace again. There are grounds for both warning and encouragement in the story of Gideon. May our victories be the equal of his, but may his failings never be those which ensnare us. May God help us.